What happens when a brilliant young lawyer, who has never lost a case, ignores a quiet warning from an old black court clerk? Cite 247, cite_start. He's about to find out that she isn't just a clerk, and the judge presiding over his case knows a secret about her that could end his career in an instant. Cite 249. The polished marble halls of the city courthouse echoed with the confident, rhythmic click of expensive Italian leather shoes. This was the sound of Alex Croft, a man who moved through the world with the unshakable certainty of someone who had never known failure. He was the golden boy of the city's most prestigious law firm, a prodigy who had graduated top of his class from a top-tier law school and had not lost a single case since. He saw the law not as a complex tapestry of human fallibility, but as a complex machine whose levers and gears he, and only he, had truly mastered. His mind was a fortress of precedent and procedure, his arguments were surgical, and his ambition was a palpable, almost aggressive force. He carried a briefcase that cost more than most people's rent, but his real weapon was the dismissive, self-assured smirk that rarely left his face. He was not just a lawyer, he was a performer, and the courtroom was his stage. As he strode toward the clerk's office to file a motion for his latest high-stakes corporate case, he was already mentally rehearsing his closing argument, already savoring the taste of a victory he considered a foregone conclusion. The other junior associates he passed in the hall would either watch him with a sense of reverent awe or quickly avert their gazes, intimidated by the sheer, blinding force of his success. He was the future, a fact his six-figure salary and the corner office he was already on track for seemed to confirm with each passing day. We've all encountered people whose brilliance in one area makes them dangerously blind in another, convinced that their intellect makes them infallible. If you believe that true wisdom is about more than what can be learned in a book and that humility is the greatest teacher of all, subscribe to this channel, because this lawyer's perfect, unblemished record is about to collide with a quiet, powerful truth he was far too arrogant to hear. Alex saw the world as a hierarchy of intellect, and he had rightfully placed himself at its very apex, completely unaware that he was about to be outmaneuvered by a woman he considered to be little more than a part of the courthouse's administrative furniture. While Alex Croft was a shooting star, a brilliant, temporary flash in the grand, old constellation of the city's legal system, the clerk's office was the system's slow-turning, gravitational center, and at its heart sat Ms. Eleanor Vance. The office itself was a world away from the gleaming, marble-floored hallways where young lawyers performed their ambition. It was a place of tangible history, a room that smelled of aging paper, binder's glue, and the faint, metallic scent of the old radiator that hissed and clanked in the winter. The soundscape was a gentle, rhythmic hum of human activity, the soft rustle of files being retrieved, the distant, muffled arguments from the courtrooms, and, most consistently, the heavy, satisfying thud of Ms. Vance's official seal imprinting itself onto a document, a sound that had marked the final, official beginning or end of thousands of legal battles over the past 40 years. She was a fixture, a woman who seemed to have been carved from the same sturdy, unpretentious oak as her massive, paper-laden desk. Her hair was a neat, silver crown, her posture was perfect despite her age, and her hands, though wrinkled and dotted with age spots, moved with a steady, efficient grace, sorting, filing, and stamping with an economy of motion that was mesmerizing to watch. She was the courthouse's living memory, the keeper of its secrets, the one person who knew not just the letter of the law, but its spirit, its history, and its many, many loopholes. While brilliant young lawyers like Alex came and went, their names briefly flashing in the headlines before they moved on to lucrative corporate partnerships, Ms. Vance remained. She had seen fiery, idealistic prosecutors burn out and become jaded defense attorneys. She had watched nervous, trembling new judges grow into stern, respected jurists. She was the one constant in a world of perpetual conflict and shifting alliances. The most seasoned, powerful lawyers in the city, men and women who would tear each other to shreds in the courtroom, would approach her desk with a quiet, almost reverent respect. They knew her true value. They knew that a quiet word of advice from Ms. Vance on a procedural filing could be the difference between a swift victory and a disastrous dismissal on a technicality. She was the gatekeeper, the oracle, the quiet, unassuming hub around which the entire, chaotic wheel of justice slowly, and sometimes grudgingly, turned. To a man like Alex, however, she was invisible. He saw not a repository of 4 decades of legal wisdom, but a simple, administrative functionary, an obstacle to be navigated, a slow, gray-haired woman whose only job was to take his brilliant legal filings and put them in the correct folder. He was utterly and fatally blind to the fact that he was standing in the presence of the most powerful person in the entire courthouse. Alex Croft arrived at the clerk's office with the self-satisfied air of a conquering general, his briefcase clicking authoritatively as he placed it on the high counter. He slid a thick, perfectly bound legal motion across the polished wood toward Ms. Eleanor Vance, the document a testament to the dozens of billable hours and the sheer force of his formidable intellect. "Motion to dismiss for filing, ma'am," he said, his tone a calibrated mixture of condescension and impatience. He expected her to simply take the document, stamp it with her official seal, and file it away, a silent, bureaucratic cog in the machine of his legal brilliance. He did not expect her to read it. But Miss Vance did not move for her stamp. Instead, she put on a pair of simple, wire-rimmed reading glasses and began to scan the first page, her eyes, honed by 40 years of deciphering the dense, often convoluted language of the law, moving with a slow, deliberate purpose. To Alex, this was an infuriating and unnecessary delay, a pointless exercise in procedural slowness. To Ms. Vance, it was a sacred duty. Her job was not just to file paper, it was to be the final, silent guardian of the court's integrity, to ensure that the machinery of justice did not grind to a halt because of a lawyer's sloppy mistake. And then, her eyes stopped. It was a small thing, a detail that 99 out of 100 people would have missed, a flaw so minor that only a mind steeped in the deepest, most arcane corners of judicial procedure would have recognized it. On page 3, in his citation of precedent, Alex had referenced a subsection of a state statute that had been amended 6 months prior, a subtle but critical change that rendered his entire legal argument technically invalid. It was a rookie mistake, a slip-up born of arrogance and an over-reliance on a digital legal database that hadn't been updated with the latest legislative changes. For a moment, Ms. Vance debated saying nothing. She knew the type of lawyer Alex was. She saw the impatient, dismissive look on his face, and she knew that her advice would be seen not as a helpful warning, but as an affront to his ego. But her loyalty was not to the fragile pride of a young lawyer, it was to the court itself. She looked up from the document, her gaze calm and steady, and her voice, when she spoke, was quiet, respectful, and utterly devoid of any condescension. "Excuse me, Mr. Croft," she began softly, tapping a single, manicured finger on the offending line. "You may want to recheck your citation here on the revised statute 2.1b. The legislature amended that section in the last session. The opposing counsel will likely use it to have this entire motion thrown out." She was not correcting him, she was offering him a lifeline, a quiet, professional courtesy from a woman with 4 decades of experience to a young man with none, a simple, helpful warning that was designed to save him from his own public humiliation. The quiet, helpful words of Ms. Vance hung in the air for a moment, a lifeline offered with gentle, professional courtesy. Alex Croft stared at her, his initial surprise quickly curdling into a hot, simmering wave of pure, unadulterated indignation. He did not hear a warning, he heard an insult. He did not see an experienced court official trying to save him from a public humiliation. He saw a lowly, overstepping clerk who had dared to question his work, the work of a man who had graduated at the top of his class, a man who had never lost a case. A slow, condescending smile spread across his face, a mask for the fury that was coiling in his gut. How dare she? He, who had spent sleepless nights crafting this motion, whose mind was a finely tuned instrument of legal strategy, was being corrected on a minor procedural point by a woman whose greatest daily intellectual challenge was likely alphabetizing files. The sheer, breathtaking arrogance of it all was, to him, almost comical. He leaned forward, placing his hands on the counter in a gesture of casual, intimidating dominance, and looked down at her, his voice a low, syrupy purr of dismissive patronage. "Ma'am," he began, drawing the word out, "I appreciate your diligence. It's truly admirable. But you have to understand, this is a complex corporate litigation matter. The strategies involved, the specific interpretations of case law. It's a bit more nuanced than simply stamping and filing. He was patting her on the head, verbally reducing her 40 years of experience to a simple, mindless administrative task. The other paralegals and junior lawyers in the busy clerk's office, who had paused their work to watch this unfolding car crash, now quickly averted their eyes, sensing the impending disaster but too intimidated by Alex's reputation to intervene. Ms. Vance did not flinch. Her expression remained one of calm, patient professionalism, her quiet dignity an unshakable wall against which his arrogance was now crashing. This lack of a cowed, apologetic response only infuriated him further. "Your job," he continued, his voice losing its sweetness and taking on a sharper, colder edge, "is to process the documents the lawyers bring you. My job is to ensure those documents are legally perfect. I've reviewed this motion a dozen times. My firm's senior partners have reviewed this motion. It's flawless." He tapped his finger on the document, a final, definitive gesture of ownership over his impending failure. "So, why don't you just file the paperwork, ma'am?" he said, the final word a deliberate, belittling sting. "I think I know the law." And with that, he stood up straight, convinced he had put the old woman firmly back in her place. Ms. Vance looked at him for a long, silent moment, her eyes holding not anger, but a profound, weary sadness for the boy who stood before her, a boy so blinded by his brilliance that he couldn't see the cliff edge just inches from his feet. Then, with a quiet, final grace, she picked up her heavy, official seal, and with a single, resounding thud, she stamped his flawed, doomed motion, officially submitting his arrogance into the court's permanent record. The final, cruel insult about the rake, delivered with a sneer, was met not with the explosion Bryce had craved, but with a silence so profound and heavy it seemed to suck all the air from the practice field. The uncomfortable snickers from the rookies died instantly, replaced by a tense, watchful quiet. The veteran players, who had been observing from a distance, now stood still, their faces grim, recognizing that a sacred, unwritten rule of respect had been flagrantly violated. In the center of this silent, impromptu arena, Mr. Jones did not flinch. He did not cower. With a slow, deliberate grace that seemed to defy the very concept of humiliation, he placed his tools on the ground and rose to his feet. It was not the pained, creaking movement of an old man, but the unhurried, measured motion of a man who was completely and utterly in control of the ground on which he stood. He brushed the dark, rich soil from the knees of his work pants and then, for the first time, he looked the multi-million-dollar rookie quarterback directly in the eye. His gaze was not angry or hateful, it was a look of profound, almost weary wisdom, a calm, diagnostic stare that seemed to bypass Bryce's arrogant, athletic exterior and see directly into the frantic, insecure heart of the boy beneath. It was the look of a man who had seen 100 young men just like Bryce, full of talent and fury, pass through this very field, and he knew, with a certainty as deep as the roots of the grass he tended, the difference between greatness and noise. When he finally spoke, his voice was a quiet, gravelly rumble, a sound that seemed to come from the earth itself, yet it carried across the silent field with more weight and authority than any coach's whistle. He did not defend himself. He did not make excuses. He simply delivered a single, devastating truth. "I know the difference," he said, his voice even and steady, "between a man who plays for the name on the back of his jersey and one who plays for the love of the game." The sentence was a perfectly thrown spiral, a quiet, philosophical dagger that landed with devastating accuracy, piercing the very core of Bryce's deepest insecurity. It was not an insult, it was a diagnosis, a calm and precise articulation of the very thing Bryce was secretly afraid of, that beneath all his talent and his hype, he was a performer, not a true player. Bryce stood there, his mouth agape, completely disarmed. He, the master of the televised trash talk, the king of the confident soundbite, had been utterly and completely undone by a single, quiet sentence. A fresh wave of hot, impotent rage surged through him, but he had no response. The old man hadn't insulted him, he had simply revealed him. Without another word, Mr. Jones gave a slow, final nod, as if dismissing a child, then knelt back down, picked up his tools, and returned to his work, his focus once again on the tangible, honest task of healing the wounded earth, leaving the celebrated rookie quarterback standing alone in a deafening silence, utterly and completely defeated. The courtroom, once Alex's triumphant stage, had transformed into a silent, suffocating chamber of his public humiliation. The opposing counsel's words, a calm and surgical dismantling of his entire motion, echoed in the dead air, leaving him exposed and utterly defenseless. The blood roared in his ears, a hot, shameful tide, and the confident, predatory smirk that was his trademark had dissolved into a pale, slack-jawed mask of disbelief. He was drowning in the silent, collective gaze of the room, every eye a testament to his spectacular, unforced error. But the only gaze that mattered was the one coming from the elevated bench, a gaze of cold, profound, and growing annoyance. Judge Albright, a man whose reputation for intellectual rigor and judicial impatience was legendary, had listened to the opposing counsel's argument without a single flicker of expression. When the argument was finished, he did not speak. Instead, he made a series of slow, deliberate movements that were far more terrifying than any verbal outburst. He slowly took off his reading glasses, placing them with a quiet, definitive click on the polished oak of his bench. He leaned back in his large leather chair, the old wood groaning under his weight, and steepled his fingers, his eyes, sharp and analytical, boring directly into Alex Croft. It was the look of a master craftsman examining a flawed, shoddy piece of work, and Alex felt himself shrink under its sheer, gravitational weight. The judge was not just looking at a flawed legal motion, he was looking at a flawed lawyer, a young man whose arrogance had led him to waste the court's valuable and sacred time with a mistake that a first-year paralegal would have been embarrassed to make. He saw the disrespect for the process, the intellectual laziness that was born of a belief in one's infallibility. He was about to grant the motion to dismiss, to make an example of this arrogant young prodigy, but then his eyes flickered for a brief, almost imperceptible moment toward the clerk station, where Ms. Eleanor Vance sat, her expression calm, professional, and utterly unreadable. A long, weary sigh escaped the judge's lips, a sound of profound disappointment. "Mr. Croft," he finally said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that was stripped of all warmth, "your motion is a mess. It is a work of profound and inexcusable sloppiness that frankly borders on contempt for this court." He let the words hang in the air, each one a fresh lash of humiliation. "And while my every instinct is to grant the defense's motion to dismiss and teach you a lesson in humility that you will not soon forget," he continued, his eyes narrowing, "I am, against my better judgment, going to grant you a single opportunity to salvage your incompetence." He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a cold, hard command. "You have 24 hours to withdraw this motion, correct your embarrassing and fundamental errors, and refile a document that is worthy of being read in a professional court of law. Do you understand me?" The reprieve was not a kindness, it was a punishment, a public acknowledgement of his failure, a 24-hour sentence to confront the wreckage of his hubris. Alex stumbled out of the courtroom, his face a burning mask of pure, unadulterated humiliation. The pitying glances from his colleagues and the triumphant, almost sympathetic smirk from the opposing counsel were like salt in a gaping wound. But his shame did not curdle into humility, it metastasized into a hot, blistering rage. He was not angry at his own mistake. He was angry at the judge for embarrassing him, angry at the opposing counsel for outmaneuvering him, and, most irrationally and intensely, he was angry at the old court clerk, Ms. Vance, for having the audacity to be right. He spent the next 24 hours in a frantic, caffeine-fueled siege, locked in his pristine office, determined not just to fix the motion but to craft a legal document so perfect, so intellectually impenetrable, that it would serve as a brilliant and crushing rebuke to all who had doubted him. He tore his original argument apart, redrafted every sentence, and cross-referenced every citation with a ferocious, obsessive intensity. This was no longer about winning a case, it was about restoring his shattered image, about proving that the previous day's failure was nothing more than a fluke, a momentary lapse in his otherwise flawless genius. Exhausted, his eyes burning from the glare of the computer screen, he returned to the courthouse the next morning, the new, supposedly perfect motion clutched in his hand like a holy scripture. He strode to the clerk's counter, his posture radiating a defiant, almost aggressive confidence. He found Ms. Vance in her usual spot, a beacon of calm in the morning's administrative chaos. He slapped the document down on the counter, his gesture a clear and final statement. Ms. Vance looked up at him, her expression holding no hint of triumph or judgment, only a quiet, weary patience. She took the document and, just as before, her eyes began their slow, methodical scan of the text. Alex stood there, tapping his fingers impatiently, a silent, simmering rage just beneath his skin. Then, her eyes paused again. She looked up, and her gaze was gentle, almost apologetic, as if she were reluctant to be the bearer of more bad news. "Mr. Croft," she began, her voice a soft, barely audible whisper, "this is much improved. But you've forgotten to attach the certified transcript from the preliminary injunction hearing. The new procedural rules require it for any motion to dismiss that cites deposition testimony." It was another small, fatal error, a detail buried in the fine print of a recent procedural update, a trap he had missed in his haste to prove his own brilliance. She was, once again, offering him a lifeline, a final chance to avoid a second, and surely fatal, public humiliation. But Alex, his ego still raw and bleeding from the day before, did not see a lifeline. He saw a second, even more insolent, attack on his authority. "Are you serious?" he hissed, his voice a low, venomous snarl. "I have triple-checked this document. Do not presume to tell me how to practice law. Your job is to stamp the papers, not to offer your unsolicited and unqualified opinions on complex legal strategy. Now file it." He had learned nothing. His humiliation had not taught him humility, it had only hardened his arrogance, and with a final, contemptuous glare, he turned and stormed away, leaving Ms. Vance holding the flawed, doomed motion, a silent, sorrowful witness to a young man who had just, for the second and final time, chosen to be his executioner. The following morning, Alex Croft strode back into the courtroom with a brittle, overinflated confidence, a man determined to erase the memory of his previous day's humiliation with a display of overwhelming legal brilliance. He had slept for maybe an hour, but he was buzzing with a manic, caffeine-fueled energy, convinced that the flawless, redrafted motion in his hand was not just a legal document, but a work of art, a testament to his superior intellect. He gave the silver-haired opposing counsel a smug, condescending nod, a silent declaration that the game was now over. The courtroom was called to order, and Alex felt a surge of triumphant certainty. This was his redemption arc, his moment to prove that the initial error was nothing more than a momentary lapse. He was about to rise and reintroduce his motion when, for the second time, the old lawyer on the other side of the aisle rose first, his expression now one of profound, weary exasperation. "Your Honor," he began, his voice flat and devoid of the previous day's theatricality, "I apologize for taking up more of the court's valuable time with procedural matters, but it seems my young colleague's corrected motion is, once again, fatally flawed." A deathly silence fell over the courtroom. Alex's heart, which had been beating with a triumphant rhythm, seemed to stop altogether. The new rules of civil procedure, amended last quarter, clearly state that any motion to dismiss citing deposition testimony must be accompanied by a certified transcript of the preliminary injunction hearing where said testimony was first entered into the record. "My opponent," he said, gesturing with a tired, almost pitiful wave of his hand toward Alex, "has failed to attach this required document. This is not a nuanced interpretation, it is a basic, fundamental filing requirement. At this point, this is no longer a simple error, it is a pattern of incompetence that is actively wasting this court's time and my client's money. We once again move for a full and final dismissal." Every word was a hammer blow, each one striking the same spot, the same wound that Ms. Vance had so gently, and so precisely, tried to warn him about just that morning. The memory of her quiet voice, her patient, knowing eyes, and his own, vicious, condescending dismissal now screamed in his mind with the force of a tornado. He had done it again. He had been offered a lifeline, a second chance to avoid this exact, public immolation, and he had, in his breathtaking arrogance, spat on it and thrown it back in her face. The judge's face, which had been a mask of stern annoyance the day before, was now a portrait of cold, quiet, and utterly terrifying fury. Alex was no longer just an arrogant rookie, he was a fool, a man who had been given a second chance by the court and had squandered it in a fit of petulant pride. He braced himself for the final, career-ending blow, for the gavel to fall and his perfect, unblemished record to be permanently shattered. But it didn't happen. The judge's face, which had been a mask of stern annoyance the day before, was now a portrait of cold, quiet, and utterly terrifying fury. Alex was no longer just an arrogant rookie, he was a fool, a man who had been given a second chance by the court and had squandered it in a fit of petulant pride. He braced himself for the final, career-ending blow, for the gavel to fall and his perfect, unblemished record to be permanently shattered. But it didn't happen. Judge Albright did not look at the opposing counsel. He did not look at the court stenographer. He did not look at anyone but the young, broken, and now utterly terrified lawyer standing before him. The silence in the courtroom stretched for an impossibly long time, a thick, heavy blanket of suspense under which Alex's entire future was being suffocated. He could feel the eyes of every person in the room on him, the weight of their collective judgment of physical force. The judge, a man known for his decisive and often brutal efficiency, seemed to be considering his options, his fingers steepled before him, his gaze a pair of surgical lasers dissecting Alex's very soul. The opposing counsel, confident in his victory, stood with a patient, professional calm, awaiting the inevitable ruling in his favor. A flicker of insane, desperate hope ignited in Alex's chest. Was the judge considering letting him off? Was there some arcane loophole, some procedural nuance that he, in his brilliance, had been right about all along? But one look at the judge's face, a landscape of pure, unadulterated contempt, extinguished that hope as quickly as it had appeared. The judge was not considering the law, he was considering the appropriate form of punishment. Finally, he spoke, his voice not a boom, but a low, dangerous rumble that seemed to make the very air in the room vibrate. "The motion to dismiss," he said, his eyes still locked on Alex, "is denied." A collective, shocked gasp rippled through the courtroom. The opposing counsel's jaw dropped. Alex's mind reeled in a state of dizzying, disoriented confusion. He had won? It was impossible. It made no sense. He had been so wrong, so publicly and catastrophically wrong. But the judge was not finished. The reprieve was not an act of mercy, it was a stay of execution, and a far more terrifying sentence was about to be handed down. However, the judge continued, his voice dropping even lower, his words now imbued with a chilling, absolute authority, "This court is now in recess." He picked up his gavel, but did not strike it. He held it in his hand, a symbol of the power he was about to wield in a much more personal and devastating way. "Mr. Croft," he said, his voice a quiet command that was somehow louder than any shout, "you will join me in my chambers." Immediately. The judge's fury, which had been a low, simmering threat, finally came to a boil, but it was not a loud, explosive rage. It was a cold, quiet, and utterly terrifying calm, a pressure that seemed to suck all the air out of the room. He looked down from his bench, his face carved from granite, and his gaze was not one of anger, but of a profound and complete contempt that was far more withering. He did not address the opposing counsel, he did not need to. His entire focus was a laser beam of judgment aimed directly at the young, broken lawyer who stood trembling before him. "Mr. Croft," he began, his voice a low, dangerous rumble that vibrated through the polished wood of the courtroom, "in my 17 years on this bench, I have seen incompetence, I have seen arrogance, and I have seen laziness. It is a rare and profoundly disappointing occasion when I see all three embodied in a single lawyer, in a single motion, not once, but twice." Every word was a hammer blow, a public dismantling of Alex's entire professional identity. "Your first motion was a failure of diligence. An embarrassing but perhaps forgivable mistake for a young lawyer who has been coasting on his reputation for far too long. But this," he said, gesturing with a dismissive wave at the flawed document, "this is a failure of character. You were given a reprieve, a chance to show this court that you possess the humility and the respect for the law that is required to practice in this room. You have responded with an even greater display of the same lazy arrogance that created the initial problem." He picked up the motion with 2 fingers, as if it were a piece of garbage, and let it drop back onto his desk. "The motion to dismiss is, of course, denied on procedural grounds. It is a worthless document, an insult to the intelligence of this court and a waste of the paper it was printed on." This was it. The final, fatal blow. Alex braced himself for the next words, the ones that would dismiss the entire case and send him back to his firm in a coffin of his own making. But the words never came. Instead, the judge leaned back, a strange, unreadable expression on his face. However, he continued, a new, chilling tone entering his voice, I will not be dismissing the plaintiff's case today. A wave of confused, shocked murmurs rippled through the courtroom. The opposing counsel looked utterly baffled. This was an unprecedented move, a departure from all judicial norms. To allow a case to proceed when its primary lawyer had just proven himself so spectacularly incompetent was unheard of. The judge raised a hand, and the room fell instantly silent. This court, he announced, his gaze still locked on the terrified Alex, is in recess. He then picked up his gavel, its wooden head feeling like a weapon of immense, personal power. Mr. Croft, he commanded, his voice now a quiet, final verdict, you will join me in my chambers. Immediately. He struck the gavel, and the sharp, definitive crack echoed through the courtroom, not as an end to the proceedings, but as the beginning of a much more personal, and far more terrifying, judgment. The sharp, definitive crack of the judge's gavel echoed in the silent courtroom, a sound that signaled not an end, but the beginning of a new, more personal form of judgment. The judge rose, his black robe sweeping behind him, and disappeared through a small, private door behind the bench without a backward glance. He left behind a room thick with a stunned, palpable silence, and in the center of that silence stood Alex Croft, a man who had been publicly stripped of his arrogance, his confidence, and his future in the space of 5 minutes. He felt the weight of 100 pairs of eyes on him, a heavy, suffocating blanket of pity, scorn, and morbid curiosity. He was no longer the brilliant, envied prodigy, he was a spectacle, a cautionary tale, a fool who had been so blinded by his ego that he had walked off a cliff in broad daylight. The walk from the plaintiff's table to the judge's chambers, a distance of no more than 50 feet, now seemed like a vast, impossible desert he had to cross. Every step was a monumental effort. His expensive leather shoes, which had once clicked with such confident authority, now seemed to make a weak, pathetic squeak on the polished floor. The air, which had once felt charged with the electricity of legal battle, was now a dead, heavy weight, each breath a struggle. His vision narrowed to a tight, blurry tunnel, the faces of the other lawyers and paralegals in the gallery becoming indistinct smudges of disapproval. He could feel their gazes on his back, not with the admiration he was accustomed to, but with the cold, clinical assessment of a pack observing a fatally wounded member. His career, which had been a flawless, meteoric ascent, was now flashing before his eyes in a series of humiliating, slow-motion vignettes. He saw the condescending smile on his face as he dismissed the quiet, helpful warning of the old court clerk. He heard his own arrogant words, I think I know the law, echoing in his mind, no longer a statement of confidence, but the epitaph of his foolish pride. He had been given not one, but 2 chances to save himself, 2 quiet, gentle lifelines offered by the most experienced person in the entire courthouse, and he had, with a breathtaking display of hubris, spat on both of them. There is a profound, and often painful, clarity that comes from a public fall from grace, a moment when arrogance is shattered by consequence. If you believe in the power of these humbling lessons and the stories of redemption that can follow, consider subscribing to our channel for more tales that explore the complex journey of character. He finally reached the imposing oak door of the judge's chambers, a door that had always seemed to him a symbol of the power he would one day attain. It now felt like the entrance to his execution. He stood there for a long moment, his hand raised but trembling, his heart hammering against his ribs, a broken, humbled man about to face the quiet, righteous fury of the one person who held the tattered remains of his future in his hands. After a single, hesitant knock, the heavy oak door to the judge's chambers swung open on its own, a silent, intimidating invitation into the inner sanctum of the law. Alex Croft stepped inside, his body rigid with a terror he had never before experienced. The room was not a place of modern, corporate power, but one of quiet, immense, and ancient authority. The walls were lined from floor to ceiling with dark, leather-bound law books, their spines a testament to centuries of legal precedent. The air was thick with the scent of old paper, beeswax, and the faint, sweet aroma of pipe tobacco, a ghost of the judge's father who had occupied this very chamber a generation before. A grandfather clock ticked with a slow, solemn, and judgmental rhythm in the corner, each second a heavy, deliberate measure of Alex's profound failure. Judge Albright was not standing, nor was he pacing in a fit of rage. He was sitting calmly behind his massive, cluttered mahogany desk, a single, low lamp casting his face in a mask of shadow and light, making him look less like a man and more like a monument carved from stone. He did not invite Alex to sit. He simply gestured to the space of floor in front of his desk, and Alex stood there, a defendant before his final judge, stripped of his expensive briefcase, his clever arguments, and his entire, now shattered sense of self-worth. The judge let the silence stretch, a heavy, suffocating blanket of quiet judgment, until Alex felt he might collapse under its weight. Finally, he spoke, his voice not a shout, but a low, dangerous whisper that was far more terrifying. "Mr. Croft," he began, his eyes, which seemed to hold the weight of every case he had ever tried, boring directly into Alex's soul. "I am going to ask you a very simple question. And I want you to think very, very carefully before you answer it." He leaned forward slightly, the leather of his old chair groaning in protest. "Why," he asked, his voice a quiet, precise instrument of intellectual dissection, "did you, a man with a brilliant mind but a complete and utter lack of wisdom, choose to ignore the direct, life-saving advice of the single most experienced and knowledgeable human being in this entire courthouse?" The question was a trap, and Alex knew it. There was no right answer. To admit he had ignored her because he was arrogant was a confession of a fatal character flaw. To claim he knew better was to double down on the very incompetence that had led him here. He stammered, his mind, usually a fortress of quick, cutting retorts, now a complete and utter void. I thought. Your Honor, she's a clerk." The pathetic excuse died on his lips, the sheer, breathtaking stupidity of it hanging in the air between them. The judge's expression did not change. He had heard the answer he had expected, the answer that confirmed his deepest fears about the young, brilliant, and utterly foolish man who stood before him. The pathetic, half-formed excuse, "she's a clerk," hung in the silent, book-lined chamber, a final, damning testament to Alex Croft's own profound and catastrophic ignorance. Judge Albright did not rage. He did not shout. He did something far more devastating. He leaned back in his chair, a slow, weary sound of creaking leather filling the room, and he looked at the brilliant young lawyer before him with a look of the most profound and complete pity he had ever shown another human being. It was the look of a master physician diagnosing a terminal illness, a sickness of the soul for which there was no easy cure. He slowly shook his head, a gesture of deep, sorrowful disappointment that was more cutting than any verbal rebuke. "A clerk," the judge repeated, his voice not a question, but a quiet, contemplative echo, as if he were examining a strange and baffling new species of fool. "That is all you see, isn't it? You look at that woman, and you see a title, a function, a simple, administrative cog in a machine you believe you have mastered. Your entire world is built on a scaffolding of titles and degrees, and the arrogant, unshakable conviction that your intellectual brilliance places you at the very top of that structure." He paused, letting his words sink into the thick, academic silence of the room. He then leaned forward, his eyes, which had been filled with a weary sadness, now hardening into chips of cold, hard granite. When he spoke again, his voice was a low, dangerous whisper, a single, devastating sentence that was designed to take Alex's entire, carefully constructed reality and shatter it into a million unrecognizable pieces. "That clerk," he said, the words precise and sharp as a scalpel. "That woman knows more about the law, in its truest, deepest, and most profound sense, than you will ever learn if you live to be 1,000 years old." The statement was a complete and utter inversion of Alex's universe. It was not an opinion, it was delivered as a statement of incontrovertible fact, an immutable law of nature he had been too blind to see. His mind reeled, a chaotic, frantic scramble to process the impossible. How could a simple clerk, a woman with no prestigious degree, no record of courtroom victories, no six-figure salary, possibly know more than him? He had memorized entire libraries of case law, had been celebrated as a legal prodigy, had never, ever been bested in an intellectual contest. The judge's words were a logical, philosophical, and deeply personal impossibility. And yet, the unshakable, absolute certainty in the old man's eyes told him that it was true, a truth so profound and so far outside his limited understanding that it made him feel, for the first time in his entire, brilliant life, like a complete and utter child. The judge's devastating statement hung in the air, a profound and unassailable truth that had shattered the very foundations of Alex's world. He stared at the old man, his mind a chaotic mess of confusion and dawning, horrified shame, unable to form a single coherent thought. The judge, seeing the genuine, uncomprehending shock on the young lawyer's face, leaned back in his chair, his expression softening from a cold fury into a deep, almost sorrowful reverence. He was no longer just a judge reprimanding a subordinate. He was now a historian, a keeper of a sacred, forgotten story that he felt compelled to share. "You look at her and you see a clerk," the judge began, his voice a low, quiet rumble that seemed to echo with the weight of decades. "Let me tell you who I see." He then began to paint a picture, a vivid and heartbreaking portrait of a different time, a different city, a different world. He spoke of a young black woman, a brilliant, once-in-a-generation legal mind, who had walked the hallowed halls of the very same prestigious law school Alex had attended only 40 years earlier. He described a woman whose intellect was a razor, a woman who had not just excelled, but had dominated, graduating at the absolute top of her class, her name engraved on the plaque of valedictorians that Alex himself had likely walked past 1,000 times without a second glance. Her name was Eleanor Vance. "She was brighter than me," the judge said, a simple, stunning admission of fact. "She was brighter than your senior partners. She was, without a doubt, the most brilliant legal mind to come out of that school in a generation. Her dissertation on constitutional torts is still required reading for every senior-level law student." He described the hope and the boundless potential of this young, brilliant woman, armed with a perfect academic record and a mind that could dance through the most complex legal theories with an effortless grace. But then, the judge's voice grew heavy with the weight of a deep, systemic injustice. He described how this brilliant young lawyer, this valedictorian, this legal prodigy, had gone out into the world, her heart full of a desire to practice the law she so deeply loved, only to have every single door slammed shut in her face. He spoke of the polite rejections from the city's top law firms, of the partners who would praise her impeccable resume and then explain, with a condescending, paternalistic regret, that their clients were not yet ready for a woman, let alone a black woman, to represent them in a court of law. He described a world where her intellect was rendered invisible, her potential nullified, her brilliance completely and utterly eclipsed by the simple, ugly, and insurmountable fact of her race and her gender. The woman Alex had dismissed as a simple, administrative functionary was, in fact, a legal giant who had been denied her rightful place in the world by the very system Alex now so arrogantly and so effortlessly inhabited. The judge's story of the injustice Eleanor Vance had faced hung in the air of the chamber, a heavy, shameful silence that was a testament to a history Alex had never known. He stood there, completely shattered, a man whose entire understanding of the world as a simple meritocracy had been utterly and completely dismantled. The judge, seeing the genuine, uncomprehending horror on the young lawyer's face, continued his lesson, his voice now a quiet, reverent tribute to the two people who had shaped his understanding of justice, his father and the woman Alex had so carelessly dismissed. "The law firms of this city," the judge said, his gaze drifting to the old, black and white photograph of a stern-looking man on his desk, "were run by small men, men blinded by a prejudice they mistook for tradition. But there were giants in those days, too. Men who saw the world not just for what it was, but for what it ought to be. My father was one of those men." He spoke of his father, the former presiding judge of this very courthouse, a man whose name was a legend, synonymous with a fierce, unwavering, and often unpopular integrity. He described how his father had heard of the brilliant young law graduate, Eleanor Vance, a woman whose genius was the talk of the university but who could not, for all her talent, find a single firm willing to give her a chance. "My father," the judge continued, a look of immense, filial pride on his face, invited her to his chambers. Not out of pity, but out of a profound respect for her mind. He had read her dissertation, and he told me later that in his 40 years on the bench, he had never encountered a legal intellect so sharp, so clear, so fundamentally sound. He described their meeting, a quiet, 3-hour conversation in this very room, where a powerful, established white judge and a young, rejected black woman spoke not as a superior and a subordinate, but as two equals, two scholars united by a deep and abiding love for the law. My father knew he could not force the city's prejudiced firms to hire her. He knew he could not undo the injustice of the world she lived in. But he also knew he could not, in good conscience, allow a mind like hers to be lost to the world. So, he made her an offer. He created a place for her where her brilliance would not just be valued, but where it would be essential. He could not make her a partner at a private firm, but he could give her the most powerful non-judicial position in the entire courthouse. He offered her the job of head court clerk, the gatekeeper, the guardian of all legal proceedings, the one person whose eyes would see every motion, every brief, every piece of evidence that passed through the halls of justice. It was not a consolation prize, it was a strategic appointment, a lifelong promise that in his court, her mind would be a cornerstone, her wisdom a guiding force, ensuring that the law, at least within these walls, was served with an integrity that the world outside had denied her. The story of his father's righteous act of defiance hung in the silent, book-lined chamber, and for a moment, Alex Croft may have believed that this was merely a history lesson, a tale of a bygone era. He was still struggling to reconcile the image of the brilliant, wronged young woman with the quiet, elderly clerk he had so casually dismissed. But the judge was not finished. The final, most devastating piece of the story was not about the past, it was about the present, about the very ground on which Alex was now standing. The judge leaned forward, his voice dropping to a low, conspiratorial tone, as if he were sharing the most important and closely guarded secret in the entire city. "You think my father simply gave her a job, Mr. Croft?" he asked, a rhetorical question that was also a profound indictment. He did not. He gave her a throne. A quiet, unassuming throne from which she has, for the past 40 years, secretly and profoundly shaped the course of justice in this city. He then proceeded to dismantle the last remaining pillar of Alex's arrogant worldview. He spoke of an unwritten rule, a piece of institutional wisdom passed down in hushed tones from senior partners to junior associates, from retiring judges to their newly appointed successors. It was a simple, powerful truth known only to the most successful and respected legal minds in the community. If you had a complex case, if you were facing a procedural labyrinth, if you wanted to ensure that your argument was not just brilliant but bulletproof, you did not go to the law library. You went to Ms. Vance. That woman, the judge continued, his voice now filled with a deep, reverent awe, is the secret weapon of every great lawyer who has ever argued a case in my courtroom. They come to her not as a clerk, but as a student seeking a master. They show her their briefs, they outline their arguments, and they listen, with the humility you so profoundly lack, as she quietly points out the flaws, the weaknesses, the fatal errors that their own brilliant, educated minds have missed. He then delivered the final, personal, and most crushing blow. "I have been a judge in this courthouse for 17 years, Mr. Croft. And I will tell you a secret that I have never admitted to another living soul. There have been times, in the most complex and difficult of cases, when even I, in the privacy of these chambers, have called upon the counsel of Ms. Eleanor Vance to help me navigate a particularly thorny procedural question. The confession was a nuke, a complete and utter annihilation of Alex's entire, pathetic understanding of the world. The woman he had twice dismissed, the woman he had deemed an unqualified, overstepping clerk, was the secret, silent mentor to the very judge who now held his entire career in his hands. The 2 quiet warnings she had given him were not just acts of professional diligence, they were acts of profound, unearned grace, a lifeline offered from the courthouse's true, hidden master, a lifeline he had, in his breathtaking, suicidal arrogance, twice refused. The full, devastating truth of Ms. Vance's hidden legacy settled in the silent, book-lined chamber, not with a bang, but with the quiet, crushing weight of a collapsing star. Alex Croft stood there, a man completely hollowed out, every last shred of his arrogance, his pride, and his self-delusion having been systematically and surgically excised by the old judge's story. He was nothing, a fool who had been so blinded by the light of his own perceived brilliance that he had failed to see the sun. The judge, his history lesson now complete, shifted his posture, his demeanor transforming from that of a reverent historian back to that of a cold, implacable jurist. The time for stories was over. The time for judgment had arrived. He stood up, his tall, imposing frame seeming to fill the entire room, and walked around his desk until he was standing directly in front of the trembling young lawyer. "You have, Mr. Croft," he began, his voice a low, dangerous rumble, "committed two profound and unforgivable sins in my courthouse. First, you have shown a level of professional incompetence and intellectual laziness that is an insult to the bar and a waste of this court's time. Second, and far more grievously, you have shown a staggering lack of humility, of respect, and of basic human decency to the single most honorable person under this roof." He paused, letting the indictment hang in the air. "A normal man, a lesser man, I would simply hold in contempt. I would have you disbarred and ensure you never practice law in this city again. But my father believed in Ms. Vance. And because of that, I am going to offer you a single, narrow, and very painful path to potential redemption." He leaned in closer, his eyes a pair of cold, hard drills boring into Alex's soul. "Here is my ruling," he whispered, the words a final, non-negotiable sentence. "You will walk out of this chamber. You will go directly to the clerk's office. And there, in front of every other clerk, lawyer, and paralegal present, you will stand before Ms. Vance's desk, and you will apologize. You will not offer a qualified, self-serving apology. You will offer a full confession of your arrogance and stupidity. And when you are finished with that, you will beg her, you will plead with her, to have the grace to look at your flawed, incompetent motion one more time and to teach you how to fix it correctly." He stood up straight, his shadow falling over Alex. "If you do this, if you perform this act of profound and necessary public humility, she may choose to help you. And if she does, I will allow your case to proceed. But if you refuse, if your pathetic pride is still more important than your future, I will not only hold you in contempt of court, I will personally see to it that your reputation is so thoroughly and destroyed that you will not be able to get a job as a paralegal in a strip mall. The choice is yours, son. Your pride, or your career. Decide." The heavy oak door of the judge's chamber closed behind Alex Croft, and he stood for a moment in the silent, marble-floored hallway, a man who had been completely dismantled and was now faced with the daunting task of putting himself back together in a new, more honest form. The choice the judge had given him was no choice at all. It was a narrow, painful, and necessary path through the wreckage of his own making. He took a deep breath, the air tasting of his profound humiliation, and began to walk back toward the clerk's office. This was a different walk. The arrogant, confident stride of the morning was a distant memory, replaced by the slow, deliberate, and heavy steps of a man on his way to his public penance. Every lawyer and paralegal he passed, the same people who had watched him with a mixture of envy and fear just hours before, now watched him with a quiet, morbid curiosity, sensing that a great and terrible judgment had been passed. He did not avoid their gazes. He met them, his own eyes stripped of all their former pride, a silent admission of his profound failure. He reached the bustling clerk's office, a room that now felt like a sacred temple he had desecrated, and he walked directly to the high counter where Ms. Eleanor Vance sat, a queen on her simple, wooden throne. He did not speak immediately. He waited, respectfully, until she finished stamping a document and looked up at him, her gaze calm, patient, and holding no hint of triumph. In that moment, in front of the entire office, in front of the colleagues he had tried to impress and the rivals he had tried to dominate, he began the most difficult and important legal argument of his entire life. "Ms. Vance," he began, his voice low, unsteady, but clear and ringing with a sincerity he had never before allowed himself to show. "I have just come from the judge's chambers. I am here to offer you my deepest, most profound, and most unreserved apology." He did not make excuses. He did not try to explain his behavior. He simply confessed. "My conduct toward you, not once, but twice, was not just unprofessional, it was arrogant, it was disrespectful, and it was born of a profound and shameful ignorance on my part. You offered me your wisdom, and I, in my blindness, threw it back in your face. There is no excuse for my behavior. I am truly and deeply sorry." He then took a final, shuddering breath and performed the ultimate act of surrender, the one that would forever alter the course of his life and his career. I have proven that I do not know the law as well as I believed, he said, the public admission a painful but necessary balm on his wounded soul. I am here to ask you, to beg you, if you would be willing to teach me. He slid the flawed, twice rejected legal motion across the counter. Would you please, he asked, his voice now a quiet, humble plea, show me how to fix it? Ms. Vance looked at the young, broken man before her, and for the first time, a small, gentle, and infinitely wise smile touched her lips. She gave a single, gracious nod, and with a quiet, steady hand, she pulled the document toward her, ready to begin his first real lesson in the law. Stories that remind us of the profound power of humility and the quiet dignity of true expertise are more important than ever. If you believe in the lessons learned from our failures and the grace of second chances, subscribe to the channel and join us for more tales that champion the wisdom of the human heart.